Welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Uri Romi, and today we're privileged to host Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, head of the Haredi Israel division at the Tikvah Fund, rabbi, author, chief halachic assistant to the former chief rabbi of Israel, clerk of the Supreme Court of Israel, lecturer at the Hebrew University and Herzliya. Rabbi Pfeffer, thanks for joining.
1 minute, that's it?
Anybody who interested in the longer version will get it later.
Okay.
Rabbi Pfeffer, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And we are on the eve of Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, and on the eve of a full lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the first time, I think, in the history of Israel, Jews will not be able to go to synagogues as they used to. Can you interpret to us the magnitude of this decision for Haredi and Orthodox Jews?
Yes. Well, first of all, like you say, it's a very, very far-reaching decision that the government is making to shut down specifically at this time. Clearly, there are good reasons for it, meaning the level of infection and new infections every day is extremely high, and that justifies radical measures. But certainly for the Orthodox, for the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi population in Israel, this is going to be supremely difficult. Like you say, it's the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a day that's completely beyond, elevated, transcendent of the rest of the year. And one of the things I would say that, you know, the ultra-Orthodox take pride in is that even though Israel is not a religious state, it's not an observant, it's not officially, you know, religion is not part and parcel of the state mechanism, at least not in a prominent way. But nonetheless, on Yom Kippur, on this day, the streets are empty, there are no cars, people generally go to synagogue and so on. And this year it's just going to be so different, and this will make, you know, it's just such a remarkable difference in terms of mindset. Technically, what will people do if the synagogues will be closed, if only a small amount of people will be able to go to synagogue? What will happen is people are going to be praying either at home, alone, or on their balconies. We have a balcony that's overlooking onto a kind of public garden with a number of balconies overlooking, so I assume we're going to have prayers on the balcony. This is not your Yom Kippur style. It's something which is, you know, really, it's a day that we're used to spending the entire day in the synagogue, the entire day in prayer, in worship, in devotion. So it's really going to be unique, really exceptional. I don't think there'll be 100% compliance, and maybe we can speak about that more down the line, but I think that there'll be a high percentage of compliance. I think that most people are going to comply, and it's really going to be a trying and difficult, and at the same time, perhaps, you know, we'll be able to somehow make the most of it, and it will be a radically different Yom Kippur experience, but perhaps we'll find a silver lining on this very dark cloud.
But why is this so important to pray together? Excuse the layman's question, okay? What's the special quality of Fahesia, of the gathering?
Yeah, so, you know, Judaism is not a Protestant-oriented religion. It's not personalized. It's very much a communal affair. Worship of God is done as a community, is done as a nation, so to speak. Now, it's true that some of the more modernizing parts of religious Judaism, modern orthodoxy, parts of the religious Zionist world, have adopted a more individualistic style of worship, and that also, you know, comes to bear when it comes to certain elements, whether it's prayer communally, Torah study, and so on. But in the Haredi version, meaning in the ultra-Orthodox communities, the community coming together is still extremely strong. Lives are based around communities. They're based around synagogues, based around communal institutions. And the most central of them is the synagogue, is the place where we come together to pray. And if this is true for all parts of ultra-Orthodox society, then for the Hasidic parts, Hasidim make about, between something like 35% of Haredi Judaism. And for them, the concept of going to the Rebbe, going to the Grand Rabbi, who is the leader of each Hasidic group, that concept of being with him on the high holy days is very, very central. It's not that, this is not biblical. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible, thou shalt go to your Grand Rebbe on Yom Kippur, but it's become so entrenched in tradition that for them to refrain from doing this will be a supreme sacrifice.
There's an edict, ונשמרתם מאוד לנפשותיכם, be very careful about your lives. And there's another mitzvah, maybe, וחי בהם, and you shall live by them. Why some or many Haredi and Orthodox people don't comply with this?
Well, first of all, I would just preface that, the great majority of Haredi Jews are compliant, but there is a strong minority, like you say, that are non-compliant. And for them, I would say their approach, if you want, is a kind of approach that's been entrenched over the generations, where our Jewish practice has been threatened time and time again by all kinds of external threats, whether it's the Tsar in Russia, where it's Spanish Inquisition, all of these events. And again, I'm exaggerating because, of course, Corona isn't the Spanish Inquisition and it's not the pogroms in Russia. But nonetheless, these Jews, mainly from the European background, are well trained in reacting, in trying to maintain the integrity of Jewish practice, notwithstanding a lot of difficult times, a lot of external threats. And some of them perceive this situation as a similar threat. They say, well, the government has its own standards, it has its own kind of train of thought, has its own mindset, has its own considerations that it weighs up. But those considerations are not necessarily ours. The way that they perceive or the way that they define a plague isn't the same way that we would define a plague. Perhaps for us, if we would be shutting down all of our institutions and synagogues and yeshiva institutions and so on, then the long-term damage would be too great a price to pay, despite the risk to health. At the same time, it has to be noted, a lot of these individuals are less aware of, even now, and I know it's already many months into the Corona crisis, but their information is not the same as the information that we have. They're not online, they don't have access to the same news and so on. And so there's also a lack of awareness. There's also a difficulty in compliance when you have such big families and such crowded environments. So it's a lot of factors together. On the one hand, you have the technical difficulties, but on the other hand, and especially on the more fringe groups, the more extremist groups, they'll say, no, this is an opportunity to demonstrate real sacrifice for upholding our religious principles. And even though, of course, you're perfectly right, there's a deep religious principle of taking care and every precaution, and life is the most hallowed, it's the most elevated of legal principles in Jewish law, but nonetheless, that's as it were relegated to the individual level, while on the communal level, these more extremist groups are saying we have to go all the way, and we mustn't bow to government regulations.
So the Corona pandemic maybe exposes a broader issue, and that is how the Haredi community, maybe the more extreme parts of it, relates to the secular government. So defying the orders is not only because of big families or gathering, like technical reasons, but also from religious or ideological or historical reasons.
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. On a certain level, what we've seen, again, with certain ups and downs, it hasn't been uniform throughout the Corona period, but we've certainly seen elements of this Haredi mindset that we're kind of a state within a state, a kind of Haredi autonomy within the state of Israel. We don't take orders from the state of Israel. We take orders from I'm saying that the Haredim would say to themselves, or at the very least, certain groups within Haredi society would be saying, we take orders from our own rabbinic leadership. We take orders from our own communities and not from the state of Israel. And therefore, whatever the state of Israel takes into account, their considerations are different than ours and their conclusions are different than ours. And therefore, we still want to treat our own communities as a kind of autonomy. I would add to that, that even though, there have been fluctuations in this and ups and downs, but recently there's also a certain, deep distrust of government. One of the issues, for example, has been the discrepancy between the demonstrations in Balfour Street on the one hand and the synagogues on the other. And Haredim are really up in arms about it. They're saying, how on earth can government continue to allow demonstrations to take place with thousands of people gathering together to demonstrate outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's house in Balfour Street in Rehavia, while synagogues are being coerced, are being forced to close their doors? Where's the justice? Where's the fairness? Where's the equality in this? Why should demonstrations receive preference over synagogues? And therefore, there's also a certain distrust and a certain, even animosity, like, what's going on here? There's something that doesn't make sense. And that's made it more difficult to really, drum in, to really penetrate Haredi society with a message of, come on, comply with regulations. It's for your good. It's for all of our good. We're one ship. We're all part of the same country. And they're saying, okay, we may be part of the same country, but we see that there's differential treatment for the secular demonstrators on the one hand and the religious people who are going to be going to the synagogues.
From the little we know about this elusive virus, people are infected more than when they gather inside, behind closed doors, and all the tricks of the capsules don't seem to really work. While even if thousands gather in the open air, like in the demonstration, protest, very few are infected. So it's not exactly balancing right against right. It's weighing big threat versus minor threat.
Well, this could be the case. I'm not going to get into the epidemiological nuance of differences between indoors, outdoors, and so on. But, just to point out, in my own synagogue, I'm a community rabbi, and we've been praying outdoors, and, we're only allowed 20 people. 20 people is not the thousands that you have in the demonstrations. And we're outdoors, and even outdoors, you can only have 20 people. So again, I'm not an expert, and I appreciate that there's a difference between synagogues, which is also relevant for all or for many, many Israelis, a couple of million Israelis that go to synagogue. So it's perhaps more relevant and more threatening than demonstrations, which are attended by a few thousand people and not more than that. But nonetheless, it's created a sense of parity, a sense of, in Hebrew we say eifa ve'eifa. There's something which is, it hasn't worked in favor of trust of government, and this has been a factor in ensuring compliance.
A few weeks ago, the Corona Tsar, Professor Roni Gamzu, suggested to use what he called the traffic light model, namely a red city should be closed while a green city should open and run as usual. Except that it turned out that most of the red Jewish towns were Haredi, like Bnei Brak and others. And because of political pressures, the government backed down, and now we have a full lockdown. Can you understand the feeling of many non-observing Israelis when they say, or they feel that they have been punished because of the Haredim?
Well, I would say that those feelings are, understandable to some degree. but also unfair to another degree, because it's true that many of the red cities, so to speak, were Haredi, and even more of them were Arab cities. But at the same time, if you delve down, if you dig down into those numbers, we'll see that they're not so high. There were red cities because there was a high percentage. Many of those percentages were related to yeshiva students who were not even in the city. They were in the yeshiva. The yeshiva went into the yeshiva is a higher academy for Talmudic studies, where you often had hundreds of people who were tested positive for corona, but they went into self-isolation, so they were not a threat to anyone else. The problem was that they were listed based on their home address, and therefore many of these yeshiva students also raised the numbers for wherever their home address was. At the same time, it's true that some of the major concentrations of coronavirus were in Haredi cities. That doesn't mean that most of the corona sufferers in Israel were Haredi. If yesterday we had 7,000 new cases of coronavirus, so even if you'll give Haredim a high number of that, so it'll be 1,000, 1,500, still the great majority is in the non-Haredi cities, but we're still, Haredim are still only 10% of Israel. So even if they have a high concentration of corona, that won't bring them to a real level where they'll be influencing policy because of their rates of infection. Perhaps
the statistics are 25%.
25%, which is very high, but it means 75% not Haredi.
Right. A big issue, as you mentioned before, is what your rabbi says. Take us to the mind of a Haredi or Orthodox, being a rabbi yourself. But a Haredi or Orthodox Jew has to decide which order he has to obey, his rabbis or that of the government.
Well, I'll tell you. This is the two separate questions. One question is, let's speak about the average Haredi person. Okay, let's call him the reasonable man in Haredi society. Who does he need to listen to? Who does he need to comply with? That's one question. But there's another question of, what does the Haredi rabbi, what does the Haredi leader have to do? What's his responsibility? And I think in this case, Haredi leadership has been found to be somewhat wanting. There's a certain level of Haredi leadership from which we expect to see more strategic thinking, more thinking ahead, and not just reaction, sometimes very short term and sometimes very heated to the issues of the moment. And I think that throughout the corona crisis, some of that strategic thinking was missing. Some of the reactions of certain parts of the Haredi leadership were also short-sighted, and like you say, sometimes decisions were made that, in many people's eyes, including in many Haredi people's eyes, were not responsible enough concerning the internally, just thinking about the good of the Haredi society itself, of their own constituents, let alone taking into account that we're part of this bigger state, that we're all part of the same ship, that when it comes to a virus, when it comes to a plague, then you can't look at yourselves as being an autonomy, because all of us are in the same boat. If one part of the boat has the plague, then the other part will also have it. So there has been some criticism of elements within Haredi leadership. I have to say that it very much depends. There was not a uniform declaration or a uniform policy within ultra-Orthodox society. Different rabbis and different leaders had different approaches, and that's been very prominent also recently with different Hasidic groups and different Lithuanian groups and so on. And really, to treat Haredi society as one block is inherently inaccurate, because there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of variety within Haredi society. But certainly that's one issue. The question of leadership, the question of strategic planning, the question of taking responsibility, that's one issue. Another issue is for the reasonable man on the Haredi street, right? Who does he take orders from? And I think on that front, there's been also a very interesting kind of diversity or development, or things that have been brought up to the surface over the coronavirus period. Because while it's often assumed that, well, all Haredim just comply with the rabbis and that's what they do, specifically over the Corona time, many individuals have begun or have invested in thinking for themselves. What's right for me? What's right for our family? Let's say my school is staying open for my children, even though based on government regulation, it should be closed. What should I do? Should I send my child to school or should I leave him home? And these are everyday dilemmas for many, many Haredi families. And I think in that sense, the Corona time has been a kind of eye-opener in bringing a lot of these delicate issues to the fore.
One of the rabbis who said Limud Torah, studying of Torah, should not be suspended is Rabbi Kanievsky. But on the other hand, Rabbi David Yosef, who first said synagogue shouldn't be closed, changed his mind when he realized how serious the situation is. Is this the old difference between Sephardic or Mizrahi rabbis, like his father, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and the Ashkenazi one, who were, while the Sephardic ones were always more liberal, shall I say, or permissive than the Ashkenazi ones?
Yeah, I wouldn't say liberal. I would say maybe more moderate. I think there is a general difference between the more Sephardi, the Eastern Bloc Haredi society, and the more Ashkenazi one coming from Eastern Europe. Coming from Eastern Europe, these are Jews who are very, very well trained in fighting the wars of religion, right? Fighting religious wars and maintaining the integrity of their communities in the face of great, great adversity. And they've kind of copied that model into Israel to some degree. Obviously, Israel is not the Tsar of Russia, and it's not Poland, but they've copied that model to some degree, and you see that in some of the more strident versions of the Ashkenazi Haredi society. The more Eastern bloc of Haredi society, the Sephardim, they're by tradition more moderate. They're by tradition more cooperative with the state. They by tradition, they're also much more inclusive of different degrees of religious practice, of different degrees of worship, and everyone can come together in the same synagogue or in the same family gathering, and even though they're all on different religious levels. That's less true of the Ashkenazi world. At the same time, I have to say, Rabbi David Yosef is not Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He's much more extreme. He's much less moderate than Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Chacham Shalom Cohen, who is the head of the Supreme Rabbinic Council of Shas, he's a very extreme person. He's very much in the Ashkenazi tradition. And at the same time, within the Ashkenazi tradition, you also have rabbis who are much more moderate. You're right that Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky came out with quite a strident position in terms of leaving things open. But the Rosh Yeshiva of Panovich, Rav Gershon Edelstein, he was, took a much more moderate, much more accommodating line. So, that you're right in the broad sense, there is this distinction. But if you hone in on the details, we'll see that there's also a lot of variety within both camps.
Do you foresee, when the dust settles, a more antagonism between Haredi and non-observing Israelis, or on the contrary, because we went through this together and soldiers brought food to Bnei Brak, etc., that we get closer to each other?
Well, it's a fair question. Unlike other existential challenges to Israel, and specifically when we have wars and campaigns and external threats, which often serve to galvanize, to unite the country together, Haredim, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, secular, traditional, and so on, everybody comes together in the face of this great external threat. In the case of Corona, which is an internal problem, we haven't seen that happening. On the contrary, it's raised tensions, like you said before. Many people point a finger of blame at Haredi society. In the politics of Israel, there's been a very fiery, even I guess you would say there's been a lot of animosity, at the very least, on the face of it, the way politics often tends to be. I think sometimes there's also misunderstandings on all sides in terms of the politicians, of what they expect, meaning they want to serve their constituencies. And I think sometimes their understanding of what their constituents actually expect of them is somewhat different to reality. I won't get into that now. It's a longer conversation. But all in all, coronavirus has raised tensions rather than mitigate tensions. External threats mitigate tensions, and here it's an internal threat, and if anything, it's raised tensions. At the same time, I would say that for the long run, I don't expect this to be a watershed moment in relations between Haredim and non-Haredim. There are bigger issues. Ultimately, you know, please God, when the dust will settle, when we'll be over the corona period, when we'll have a vaccination, whenever that should be, then the bigger issues are making sure that the ultra-Orthodox will be able to participate in broader Israeli society in terms of the workforce, in terms of education, and so on and so forth. And these are also existential issues for Israel. And I think ultimately those are going to be the most significant or the most prominent of issues. And they will just, you know, force us, as it were, to cooperate. They will make sure that we will be able to live, you know, one alongside the other, and indeed to cooperate and to live together. And the reality demands that of all of us. And, you know, we're in the Middle East and tensions can spike, but then they can also recede.
Right. A question from Alfred Müller on a very practical level. How do you think Yom Kippur will be this year? Prayers at home or balconies, groups on the street next to the synagogue? What do you recommend your community to do?
Well, yeah, this is a very, very, you know, troubling question right now. I'm receiving many questions from many different people in my community and outside of my community. Many are going to be praying alone, and they're asking me, how should we pray? What should we do? We are going to be praying outdoors in our community, but we're going to be skipping a lot of the traditional parts of the Yom Kippur services. We'll be skipping because we can't have people praying outdoors at 11, 12 o'clock in the heat of the day on a fast day. That doesn't make sense. The most important part of Yom Kippur is the fast. It's the holiest day of the year. It's a day when we're forbidden from eating and drinking. You can't have people praying at 12 o'clock outdoors. So we're going to be skipping a lot of parts of davening. Many people will be praying on their balconies together with other people on the balconies. And, you know, people are trying to make do and to make arrangements, but obviously it's going to be very, very challenging, a very, very different Yom Kippur experience than what we're used to every year. I don't think anybody's going to be forgetting Yom Kippur 2020.
Rabbi Pfeffer, in conclusion, in these challenging times and on the eve of such an awesome day, can you give us some words of comfort?
Words of comfort. Well, I think, you know, Yom Kippur is a time of comfort. You know, the Mishnah, which is the very early Tanaic text, says that on Yom Kippur, the tradition was that the girls would go out, unmarried girls, you know, young maidens of Israel would go out into the vineyards, and young men would come and would choose partners. Meaning Yom Kippur is a day of relationship, it's a day of love, and it's a day of love between God and between you know, the Jewish people and the world generally, and it's a day of compassion. It's the day on which we receive atonement, right? The verse in Proverbs tell us that love covers on all iniquity, covers over all sin, and that's what Yom Kippur is really all about. It's about that relationship, the intimacy, the closeness, and I think it's a comfort because, you know, we're going through times of hardship. These are times which we haven't experienced in our lifetimes. It's really something which is, you know, exceptional. Nobody remembers any similar period. And it's just a time that accentuates how dependent we are on God, how things that we generally take for granted are not self-evident, they're not obvious. And as we plan for the next year, right, this is the new Jewish year, it's the new agricultural year, as it were. You know, we look upwards and we hope for better times, and we rely on that love, on that closeness, on that relationship. So we can pray and hope for better times ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi, for these gratifying words. And Gmar Chatima Tova to you and your family. Gmar Chatima Tova is a good final sealing. Let's hope it's not lockdown, but sealing. And Gmar Chatima Tova to all our participants here and viewers. I want to thank my colleagues at JPC, Talia Decker and Rachel Exil, for making this session happen. Stay tuned to our next events and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Bival. Thank you.